So today you're going to get the absolute pleasure of watching me do some guitar wiring. Our unfortunate test subject is this lovely, custom, fretless, semi-hollow Explorer bass guitar. It's a project that I'm doing in collaboration with my BFF Frank. At this point, he has done many of these custom instruments, either built from kits or modified from existing guitars and basses. And generally, I am the guy who tries to make all of the wiring for Frank's projects work. So this time I'm doing it on camera, so I can share the experience with all of my lovely viewers. I'm using the jazz bass style wiring, which is very common in basses and fairly easy to do. You can find the schematic easily in a search engine, but the one I've provided here is from Seymour Duncan. The parts list here is very simple. You just need 2 volume pots, 1 tone pot, 1 film capacitor, a 1/4-inch jack, and 2 bass pickups. The value of these pots and the capacitor are very much so up to personal preference, but there are some rules here. It's kind of beyond the scope of this video to discuss the effect of different capacitor values and what effect they're going to have on the tone control or the different types of potentiometers you would use. This information is widely discussed elsewhere, and if you're interested in the topic, then I definitely recommend that you go and do some research about it. So this is not the master class on guitar building or guitar wiring or anything like that. This is simply me documenting my experience and sharing what I know in the process. So I'm not sure how assembled the components are here, so the first step would just be opening it up and just observing what is already in place so we can figure out what exactly it is we need to do here. It is much worse than I expected. The wiring inside here is very ugly, so I think the best move is to get everything out of here, clean up the lumpy solder, and start over fresh. I have to say it every time, get yourself a fume extractor if you're going to be soldering. These fumes are very harmful for your health. A fume extractor does not cost very much, and it actually makes it pretty convenient for working in areas where there isn't adequate ventilation. A solder wick and a solder sucker will make the removal of the old solder much easier. We have to be careful not to scratch the finish, especially using pliers to loosen the nuts on the pots. Use the pliers just enough to bust the nut loose, then use your fingers to get it off the rest of the way. These pots are going to be exposed to prolonged high temperature several times during this process. It's important to give the pots plenty of cool down time between soldering, especially when heating the body of the pots directly. Now, some of this wiring could be reused. I'm going to remove most or all of it and start over new. I'm also trying to reflow the ground leads to be reconnected later. The connection for the tone capacitor and the ground wire from the tone pot seem passable, so I will leave these in place as well. Now I noticed something alarming here. There are no wires from the pickup poking through the body of the bass, and the wires that were soldered on before had been cut pretty far away from the connection. This is very bad news if they had been cut too close to the pickup in order to add an extension wire to it, and even still it will make for sort of an ugly joint that might be kind of big and lumpy and hard to route through the body without drilling it out bigger. We'll just have to see when we get there. So there's really no way to tell except just to loosen the strings and take the pickups out and see how much wire is still connected to it. So thankfully, it looks like we have plenty of room to splice a new wire onto the pickups. I even ordered a matching wire so I can make the repair as clean as possible, although it will appear a bit crude anyway. This cable is called a shielded single conductor guitar circuit wire. Let's cut off a nice long piece to make sure we have plenty. We can always trim it down later if we want. This cable has a braided shielding around the main conductor wire, which we will twist together tight and eventually solder to a ground. Just make sure you cut through the outer layer of the cable and expose a good portion of this inner shielding. I'm going to use heat shrink here for style points mostly, but electrical tape would work just fine as well. So we just go for a good mechanical connection first, twisting the conductor to the conductor and the shielding to the shielding. You may want to adjust the length of the exposed wire so both joints don't land in exactly the same spot. Then we just need to solder each one of these. Let's make sure the conductor stays isolated from the shielding. We could use a smaller piece of heat shrink here, but tape will also work. Next we will slide the big heat shrink tube over the entire splice, carefully heat it up with a lighter, and the repair is done. And we repeat the process for the next pickup exactly the same way. And now we ought to be ready to begin our build in earnest. Now I'm just going to take a moment to prep some of our normal wires for the rest of the build. Taking into account the distance they will have to reach from one component to another. Some of you may have wire stripping pliers. I've tried them myself. I think the cheap ones are terrible, so I use a razor blade instead. Being careful to cut through the outer layer of insulation only and pulling off the excess. So I decided I don't like the old ground wire on the tone pot anymore, and I'm going to remove it real quick and add a new wire. If you take a peek at our schematic, you'll see that we need to bridge all of our pots together from ground to ground and connect the ground from the tone pot to the sleeve of the output jack. To make this connection, I twist both wires together first and then solder that onto the body of the pot, using plenty of heat. Now I would consider this to be a mistake. It was rather short-sighted of me to tin these wires before attempting to twist them together into one connection, since the solder makes them much harder to twist, and we would certainly make a better connection if this were not the case. So plan ahead for this. If you need to twist two wires together or make any kind of mechanical connection, it's best to do this before adding any solder. So now we'll use another piece of heat shrink where the ground is connected to the jack. Make sure you slip it on there before you solder, then just carefully hit it with a lighter. Now a heat gun may be the preferred method here over a lighter, but my heat gun is outside in the van and I am lazy. And just make sure you give these pots a little cool down time in between soldering to avoid damage. So now I'm going to come back to the two volume pots and reattach our little jumper wires that go from the pins to the ground. It's getting a little ugly with all the lumpy solder on the back of the pots. That's just what we get for reusing old parts, I guess. I think it will work just fine, even if it looks kinda gnarly. I'm just trying to flow the solder in a way so it's more smooth and shiny than chunky and dull. This is a good visual way to judge the quality of your soldering. Now let's take another peek at that schematic. As you can tell, we have to connect the first pin of the two volume pots together. Then the first pin of the bridge volume pot will be connected to the middle pin of the tone pot, and that will be connected to the tip of the output jack. So again, we will twist together the wires wherever two wires are supposed to connect to the same pin, just to make the connection easier and cleaner. Going for a good mechanical connection before adding solder will give you the best durability. Again, same deal with the heat shrink as before. The output jack is always a weak link, so the extra reinforcement here is bound to be useful. At this point, we are almost finished. We just need to reinstall the pickups and solder them into our circuit, as well as the ground wire from the bridge, and then mount all of the parts onto the body of the base. Now, I had a lot of trouble routing the wire from the neck pickup through the body, and I kind of worked out the issue off the camera. So now we can determine how long these wires actually need to be. Turns out they can be quite a bit shorter, so we will trim them and prep the ends again, along with the ground wire from the bridge. Refer to the schematic and you'll see it's still very simple. The pickup's conductor wire connects to the middle pin of the volume pot, and the shielding gets soldered to ground on the back of the pot. Then the bridge ground wire will be soldered to the back of the tone pot. It takes a lot of heat to make the magic happen here on the backs of the pots. And I'm having plenty of trouble trying to get this ground attached. And then finally the ground wire from the bridge. Now, in theory, the wiring should work. Let's just plug it into my practice amp and find out. Usually tapping on the pickups will produce a sound that is sufficient enough for testing, but that doesn't seem to work with these pickups. But plucking the strings, of course, is a good test also. It's a little awkward to protect the dangling wiring harness while still trying to test the bass at the same time, but I have determined that both pickups are functioning here, so we'll just call that a good short test and we'll diagnose any deeper problems later. Only thing left to do now is to mount everything where it's supposed to go. All of the pots, the output jack. Again, being as careful as you can not to scratch up the finish with your pliers. So everything seems to be in working order after I buttoned everything up. That is another successful wiring project in the books. Now, another project that Frank and I are working on is an 8-string electric baritone guitar, also from a build kit. I intend for this actually to be my new main electric guitar for making heavy metal music. A few extra lower strings and a longer scale length are guaranteed to make my tone a lot heavier. A few roadblocks along the way have put this project on the back burner. Unfortunately, it's been hanging around for a while, but we're getting some of the bugs worked out and it's going to be coming up soon. And of course, I'm going to be making a video on the process, and this is going to be a pretty big video on this one, I'm feeling. So if this sounds interesting, definitely subscribe and stay tuned. I also build effects pedals, I offer production tips or music tutorials, pretty much so anything in the field which I find interesting or I think might be useful to my viewers. It's kind of random over here, but if you're a musician, then I think you'll have fun. I also have all of my original compositions up here on my YouTube channel as well, if you're interested in checking any of that out. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, John Johnson and AJ BRRRR. You guys are the real MVPs over here. Thank you very much for your contribution, and thank you for being awesome in general. I appreciate everyone who stuck around until the end. I hope you all enjoyed, and
have fun out there.